It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome to Hats and High Viz, week 14 of our show, Jack. We've been through the election and we've come out the other end. Joining me today is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, Jack. How are you?
G'day, Jack.
Yes, and look, as usual, we enjoy your feedback and we encourage it. Don't we, Jack? Even when it's a bit mean.
Well, I quite like the mean stuff. That's why I've been very disappointed so far. There's been far too much nice stuff.
Look, death threats, whatever you want. You know, you can throw it all at us, and the way to do that is to hit us up on the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. It's got a "the" in front of it. If you like what you're listening to as well, give us a review on your podcast app. And, of course, you can hit me up on Jack the Insider. My DMs are always open. So give us a shout-out if you like what you hear. If you don't be afraid to drop us a line. We will put it in the show and not even censor it, Jack. Not even the bad words, the horrible words, the swearing, the abuse.
That could all go in.
All can go in, yeah, good on you. All right. So last week it was a bit odd. There was a lot of criticism in the media and from the opposition about Anthony Albanese being in the Ukraine. And we did talk about this and we decided it was a bit of a photo op for Albo. He'd just come from a NATO meeting. And then Angus Taylor, among other Liberal identities, came forward to say that Albo should have been home during the Sydney floods, Jack. It's all a bit much, isn't it?
Well, I suppose that's a bit of a reaction to the kerfuffle over Morrison being in Hawaii when the bushfires were raging.
Look, there's a bit of difference, though, isn't there? There's a little bit of difference between Hawaii, Waikiki Beach, and walking around a war zone.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. but politicians are always going to have a crack at each other. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I know. But what was really sort of odd was that it transpired that Peter Dutton was actually overseas with his wife in the US, and I think it's kind of got that sort of official visit. I'm going to visit a few places anyway as opposition leader.
Well, I think he said, I saw the piece in the paper about this. He said he was going to the US-Australia leadership dialogue in Washington on the trip, but other than that, it was holiday. And about that, I would say the job of opposition leader and the job of prime minister are quite different. And I don't think.
You sure he's not just? You sure he's not just calling in on this place just to pay for the airline tickets?
He could be. Could be.
Because they often do. It's an old stunt, isn't it?
It is.
You know, that you have a lovely trip into Europe or the United States and go, look, I'll do a little bit of business while I'm here and then charge it all back.
It's not something that's restricted to politicians, I might add.
No, it isn't. But in our politics, it's we, the taxpayer, who pay for these things. And so there are these sort of get-outs for all of our representative politicians, and particularly those at the pointy end.
Yeah, but the jobs are different. The opposition leader's job is different to the Prime Minister. We expect the Prime Minister to be where he needs to be. The opposition leader can be wherever he wants to be, really, as long as he's as long as he's doing some kind of a job of being an opposition leader.
Yeah, no, look, that's absolutely right. But it did mean that the Angus Taylor criticisms sort of fell a bit flat when it turned out. Where's your boss, by the way, today? He's in the States. So it was kind of amusing.
That's the risk of politics. That's just how it works. If you have a crack, you might get one back.
Yeah. Angus. I think Angus. I'm not even sure that he knew because there were a number of others. Some of the Liberal women, Jane Hume had a crack. I mean, one or two others stepped forward and said, "Do you actually know your boss is overseas at the moment?" And of course, there is that sort of holiday period. Not so much for an incoming government. But you do see this post-election, don't you, that a lot of pollies will take a bit of time off because they've just run themselves ragged in a campaign.
There is a post-losing election holiday period for most people who go out of government, that after some years of the grind of the daily grind of being in government, they need to get away and refresh.
Now, look, there's been further criticism from within the media, particularly Press Gallery, those who attended and journeyed around Europe and in Ukraine in particular with Albo, that basically there's not enough support. There wasn't in this particular case. There wasn't enough support around the PM to keep journalists informed. And I just want to talk about that in a minute, but I just want to give you some background. This was in the Oz Media story today, the 11th of July. Since winning the election in May, Albo's office has undergone some significant changes. Long-time Press Secretary and ex-political journo, Matthew Franklin, g'day Matthew, good man, who had been Albanese's main press flack for almost a decade, left unexpectedly, leaving a distinct lack of actual newsroom experience among the Labor leaders' crew. Press office is now led by Liz Fitch, who I don't know, and the PM has sought to bolster his team's media credentials with the recent appointment of former TV political corros from SBS, Brett Mason. On the recent European trip, tensions between the PMO and the press pack came to a head in the foyer of an upmarket Paris hotel after Albanese had met with French President Emmanuel Macron. The journos are alive to the likelihood that Albo was planning to travel to Ukraine to meet Zelensky, quizzed one of the PM senior staff as to whether there were any updates on the possibility of such a visit and what pool arrangements might be in place for the media. And in front of a group of 10 journalists, the Albanese staffer said, "I don't have any more updates for you, and now I'm going shoe shopping." Well, you are in Paris. That's kind of what you do.
I'm guessing that's not a bloke.
Well, maybe. It is Paris.
Yeah, it could
be. So you might just want to explain how important it is to have that connection between the PMO and the press pack, Jack.
Well, it's good if it works, but it doesn't always work that well. And I don't know that I'm a fan of the media getting their knickers in a knot about whether they were told this or told that in time.
It does seem a lot like, well, here we are in an upmarket Parisian hotel, Jack, and they're jacking up. Why don't they just go, look, I'll file later and go back to my room and order croissants?
Well, no. Some of the press gallery journalists that we both know from years ago would have said, well, that's it for us. We're off for a long lunch.
Exactly right. That'd be so nothing? Okay. All right. Well, I'll cobble something together for later on. And then I'm off for a drink. I'm off for a bit of sightseeing.
Meanwhile, let's give that expense account a workout.
Look, how important is a relationship between the media and the PMO? I mean, famously, when we go back to Paul Keating's days as PM, he believed that when he won the unwinnable in '93, he didn't know the media anything because the media had been kicking him around for the previous year and a half. And then basically you saw a media scorned and then writes some. They've become very, very critical of him in the following years. So it's this kind of almost unnatural relationship that exists, isn't it? You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours.
It is a bit overlaid with elements of being in a primary school schoolyard. People, having best friends and falling out and all that sort of stuff.
Sorry, I'm still getting past this bit. You're in Paris. You have nothing to do, and you're complaining about it. You have nothing officially to do, and you're complaining about it. Yeah. Oh well, I've got a couple of good mates in Paris. Paul Ham over there. I would have caught up with Paul, and we would have had a lovely night out. Yes, all right. Look, one of the stories that really created a lot of correspondence on my email account, not necessarily related to the show, was the Commonwealth dropping the prosecution of Bernard Colliery, the former ACT Attorney General, in private practice. And this is a protracted matter that goes back over years, with the Commonwealth seeking to prosecute him essentially for facilitating the dissemination of confidential secret Australian secrets. And you might just want to give us a little bit of a background on that, Jack, with Timor-Leste.
Well, the Australian government decided that it wanted. They were in the process of agreeing what's called certain maritime arrangements treaty, CMATs, I think it is, and which was a treaty regarding the what happened to the gas that's in the sea between Timor and Darwin, basically, and as part of the negotiations, they decided to bug the cabinet room in Timor, in Dili. And they did this, as I understand it, by offering to have the Australian government pay for refurbishment of the government offices there. And while they were doing that, they popped in the bugs.
Yes, they bugged because these meetings were being held in Timor-Leste. Then they bugged, I think, two official officers. I think it wasn't the Parliament. And that was done by ASIS, Jack, and that's the ASIO sibling, intelligence sibling that does all the dark work overseas.
Yeah, it does. It does indeed. This is. Our listeners mightn't agree with this, but this is kind of normal behaviour to try and do this sort of stuff. This is what we pay them for.
Well, yes. So basically, what the Australian government was trying to do was discern the Timor-Leste position on these gas, oceanic gas deposits. In order to get hold of them and mine them. So what we're talking about here is the national interest, or at least a perception of it, isn't it? And that the Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, at the time, he was basically going to bat for Australia's interests, which meant ripping off the people and the government of Timor-Leste.
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were ripping them off. What they were doing was trying to find out what the Timor position was internally within the Timorese government.
Giving them an advantage in negotiations.
Give them an advantage in negotiation, or to give them a heads up as to what to expect. Now, whether that means they ripped off, that's a different question, whether they were using it to rip off the Timorese or whether they were acting in the interests of Australia. So that's a whole separate question.
It is that sort of very murky sort of business of what is the national interest.
It is, and whenever anything that ASIS is involved with is going to look a little bit murky to most Australians. I agree with that, but that's just the reality of life in foreign relations and international affairs.
You remember the ASIS? Kerfuffle in Melbourne, Jack, when they went on their training exercise and running around waving guns at people? Do you remember that?
It was, yes, yeah, I do. It was the little hotel that's now gone down on Spring Street there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And made a bit of a mess of things. That was during the early years of the Hawke government. And I don't think until that time people actually knew who ASIS was.
That's probably right. And both ASIS and ASIO are a lot more public now than they used to be. They were almost not acknowledged in the old days. I think the Australian got this right this morning, that the intelligence community is kind of divided over whether the prosecutions of Witness K. Witness K, by the way, was the person who placed the bugs or who organised.
It was part of the group that did,
did that. And Bernard Collery, who was his lawyer, that's what he was being prosecuted for on a conspiracy charge. I think it's probably fair to say that the intelligence community is divided over whether those prosecutions were right or wrong.
Mm. We do know that Witness K actually pleaded guilty.
He did.
and because it was a straightforward matter.
I think he got 3 years suspended, wholly suspended.
That's right. No custodial sentence.
Yeah.
But yes, what he was, it was a straightforward matter in his case. I mean, he had released material was secret and confidential.
Yes.
You know, I mean, and I think he acknowledged that. So where this came sort of to a head in terms of law enforcement activity was that Witness K and Bernard Collery, his lawyer, were both going over to The Hague, where Timor-Leste was seeking some form of order from the World Court.
A rap on the knuckles for Australia for spying.
For doing a bit of naughty stuff. And so the Wallopers turned up at Collery's home and at Witness K's home, seized their passports and charged them. It's a long time ago, and it just seems to be almost a sort of Kafkaesque sort of experience now for Bernard Collery, who is a highly respected lawyer and so forth. So last week, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus said, "My decision was informed by the government's commitment to Australia's national security and our relations with our neighbours. This is an exceptional case." And it was basically at his discretion that the prosecution was dropped.
Yeah. Mark Dreyfus was Attorney General during part of this process in an earlier stage. So, it's an unusual situation, you know.
So where do we go from now, Jack? Will Bernard Collery be compensated?
It's very hard to say from the outside. I should imagine he'll have all his costs paid. Whether he gets an ex gratia payment beyond that, I don't know.
Could he sue the government? Or should he?
He could, but he might not win.
Yeah. I mean, the process has really almost taken 20 years, and he's been under charge now. As you say, well, Dreyfus was AG briefly in, what are we talking about, 2010. So it's been going on that long. So is it a case, Jack, I suppose, if we wanted to sum this up, as a decent Attorney General making a decent decision?
Look, I think it's better that it's over.
Yeah.
I think it's been allowed to go on too long. That's certainly true.
It just seemed to drag on unnecessarily, certainly in the case of Collery. It just seemed that the government, the previous government, was just being wrong-headed about it, being stubborn.
Well, I think they were under pressure from at least part of the intelligence community who said, we just can't tolerate this stuff. We just can't tolerate the leaking of internal intelligence matters. And there is a point to be made about that. The ASIS, and this is not peculiar to Australia, all of the foreign intelligence services around the world do some murky stuff. And it's in the interests of those countries and of ours, when it's our people, to not spread that across the front pages of newspapers.
Did you might, so I should have mentioned this earlier, but the head of ASIS turned up on 7:30 a couple of weeks ago for an interview.
I saw him.
Did you see? It's rather...
Like I say, there was a time when it wasn't like MI5 and MI6 where the British government sort of denied they existed, despite everyone knowing where the office was. But ASIS wasn't quite denied in the same way, but it was at least discreet. And the idea of an head of ASIS appearing on the 7:30 report, or TDT back in the day, was just unheard of.
Yeah, well, that was the reason. It's Paul Simon, by the way, is the Director General of ASIS. He's a man with a long military background and intelligence gathering background spanning 35 years.
He did a good job on the 7:30 report. I still wondered whether it was wise that he did it.
But he was saying people don't know who we are, and furthermore they think that we're involved in some, because they'd sent out some questionnaires. They'd done a bit of surveying, Jack. And they came back with some responses that clearly thought, gee, we don't do any of that. I mean, it obviously was some fairly horrid perceptions about what they do. And so there was this sort of attempt because we want to have a little bit of publicity, but not too much. I don't know if you remember that. It was quite.
That's always difficult to do.
It is a bit. So we just have publicity to this far, but beyond that, we won't be talking about anything.
No, you're better off having none.
Yeah, I guess that's the way they have to operate. Anyway, look, well done to the current government, I think, and well done to Bernard Colliery for sticking staunch in all of this. It's been a hellish episode. He must have felt like he was waking up in Kafka's The Trial there for a while, because it just went on and on and on. Probably the most important thing that occurred last week, Jack, in terms of our national interest, is that Wang met Wang, and that is Penny Wong, our foreign minister, met her Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, in Bali. And it's the first, really, face-to-face meeting between the PRC and Australia for, years.
It is. And it's a good thing.
Yeah, look, we've got to try and get this right. It's really difficult, isn't it? The relationship with China and Australia is very difficult. Before we went to air, you said it's a completely different interest, and that's the thing, isn't it? Completely different perceptions of our national security interests.
That's the thing that it seems to me that a lot of the press don't understand, is that different countries have different interests. It's not all holding hands and being good buddies. Even amongst allies, countries have different interests.
Yeah, it's not just about banquet journalism, sitting down and having a good feed and a chat and a photo op afterwards. But Mr. Wang issued what they call a 3-year communication freeze, came out of it and said that China was now willing to, and I quote, re-examine and recalibrate the bilateral relationship based on mutual respect. But there was a provision of a 4-point list of actions Australia that Wang Yi believed Australia must take to get the relationship back on the right track. And the first of these was Australia must treat China as a partner rather than a rival. Yeah, okay. Second, the two countries must seek common ground while shelving differences. Yeah, okay. Third, Australia must reject manipulation by a third party. Gee, I wonder who that could be, Jack. Who would be that third party?
We'll get back to that in a moment. It's a mystery. Yeah.
Fourth, both countries must build public support featuring positiveness and pragmatism. So I look at those first two and go, yeah, okay, they're not hard to achieve.
Well, they're anodyne, aren't they?
Yeah. So they're all a bit anodyne, to be honest. But the third one is Australia must reject its other partnerships, including presumably the US. When they mention manipulation by a third party, that would be the United States and possibly AUKUS and the UK. It could involve those countries, that country as well. So that seems a little bit more difficult because therein lies a direct conflict between the strategic interests of both countries. And the fourth one, both countries must build, and I'll quote this again, public support featuring positiveness and pragmatism. That just seems like we should be a promoter of China, regardless of their conduct and what they do. So I don't know that the third and fourth things are all that easy to achieve, Jack.
Well, I should imagine Minister Wong would thank her counterpart for the suggestions, and they'd take them on board and give them adequate consideration at an appropriate time.
What can we expect from Australia in terms of Australian response here? I mean, this idea that we re-examine and recalibrate, we basically need to stabilise the relationship. That's got to be the first objective, isn't it?
Well, I think that the government will be resistant to the idea that the problem with the relationship rested with the previous government. I think that the Australian government will be saying there are problems with the relationship, yes, and they are problems that we both have.
Yes, well, President Xi Jinping's senior envoy, that's Mr. Wang himself, blamed the coalition government's previous government's irresponsible words and deeds for the rupture in the relationship. Now, without getting into the politics of that, what Australia needs to avoid is, the megaphone diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I think not just Australia, but the Australians and the Chinese would be better off with a little bit less megaphone.
Yeah, they do reach for the megaphone themselves on occasion, don't they?
Yeah. And to be fair, the problems with Australia's relationship with China are not peculiar to Australia. Those problems exist with the Chinese relationship with the United States, with Japan, and with various Southeast Asian nations as well, and with India. So we ought to be, doing what a good government would do, which is to act in our interests and to keep an eye on our relationships generally, not just with China, but with India and with Japan and the United States and Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. And when conversations of a difficult nature occur, they should be occurring behind closed doors.
Preferably, yes.
When you get to things like human rights, concerns about human rights, that those things should be discussed behind closed doors, and expressions of concern made, but you don't grab the bullhorn and just yell across the Pacific.
No, there will be matters that that both governments will be unhappy with, and they ought to be addressed behind closed doors as much as possible.
When we went to air last week on our Around the World show, our foreign service show, news had just come to hand just as we started recording. That was on the 8th of July, that the longest serving Prime Minister in Japan, Shinzo Abe, there'd been an assassination attempt, and within about 4 to 5 hours of those reports coming through, it was announced that Albo had been killed. It's the first assassination that I can recall of a major political figure for many, many years, Jack.
Yeah, that is stretching my memory a little bit. There was a Scandinavian chap who was shot in a shopping centre. I can't remember how long ago that was.
Yeah, that was the Swedish Prime Minister.
Swedish Prime Minister, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Ex-Prime Minister, I think, wasn't it?
What it told me, some weird fascinations, but I do have fascinations around the way things are reported. And even when you and I were talking about this last Friday, within probably 2.5 hours of the incident occurring, the news reporting was kind of all over the shop. There were reports that offered different information, often in conflict to one another. I was looking at Japanese news. I looked at the New York Times. I looked at some of the local news as well. And there was a great sort of sense of not anyone really not knowing. I mean, they were trying to provide information that I think in the end some of it ended up being junk. And that's the way things always unfold with these major events.
Yeah, people rush to get in, not in print these days, but rush to get some content up on the screen. And sometimes it's just better to be a little bit slower getting up there and a little bit more accurate.
Yeah, that's right. And what probably was known at the time was that he was not likely to survive his injuries.
Yeah.
And that took a number of hours. I mean, we go all the way back to JFK, Jack. He was, and I was watching the Oliver Stone film just briefly because it's a piece of junk, quite frankly. Just briefly, a few minutes of it.
I wouldn't use it as an historical source.
No, it's not historical. A lot of misinformation in there, a lot of dodgy facts. But there was the report.
I don't think Oliver's ever met a conspiracy theory that he didn't love.
Yeah, exactly. But they did use did use footage of actual news reporting from the assassination, and JFK was immediately described as shot and wounded, rather like Shinzo Abe was on last Friday. The election went ahead, Jack. The seats in the Japanese Parliament's upper house with the LDP, which Shinzo Abe was from. They won 8 additional seats and won a majority of the contested seats, but not enough to take a single majority overall. So they will continue in coalition. Yes, I mean Abe has been eulogised in the papers today, in Australian newspapers today. There's a piece from Tony Abbott, and I did notice Malcolm Turnbull had taken to Instagram to basically praise Shinzo Abe. They're very similar. That's probably the first time they've shared an opinion in common, Jack.
Not since the days they were at the Bulletin, I think, about 25 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, they both had a great deal of time for Shinzo Abe. There are criticisms about him, of course, Jack. He was a very reluctant person to acknowledge Imperial Japan's outrages during World War II and into China, into Manchuria. And he sort of believed that no apology should be given. He did, however, place flowers at his film with Scott Morrison, and so it must have been about 3 years ago, I would think, where he was placed flowers at the site of the Darwin bombing. But generally speaking, that's been one of his criticisms, and that causes enormous ructions with China, doesn't it? You know, that the rape in Nanking wasn't all that bad and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I don't think relations between Japan and China were at their best when Abe was Prime Minister of Japan.
Yeah, there were a lot of particularly.
I haven't read the Chinese press today, but I can't imagine there's going to be glowing eulogies for Shinzo Abe in the Chinese press.
Well, it was almost provocative. You might remember that during this time there were, history textbooks that were released for study within Japanese high schools that, basically just blanked over Imperial Japan's some of the worst things they did occurred in China, and it just sort of glossed over them.
Yeah.
But
like most politicians, he wasn't probably all good or all bad.
Yes, and there was. I think he's the only Japanese Prime Minister to address both houses of Parliament in Australia. I think he did that, and is considered. If we listen to the generally conflicting, but in this way unified opinions of Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, Shinzo Abe was an ally that we could rely, a leader of an allied country that we could rely upon.
Yeah, and I think he's generally, I think the US political establishment probably views him pretty much the same way.
Yes, all right. Yeah,
even amongst people who don't agree themselves about much, they tended to agree that he was a useful ally and a good friend to their country.
We did see the rising sun cast onto the Opera House, Jack, and some people think these symbolic sort of references like this are rather pointless. It was said by the Japanese ambassador to give the people of Japan great comfort. They're not actually bad things to do.
I wonder how important they are, but there's been a hell of a lot of work being done since the late 1940s to build a good relationship between Australia and Japan. Right back to the end of the Labor government and the start of the Menzies years, that was consistently worked hard at, and some individual people made a great effort to help that along. I know that the wonderful Weary Dunlop was an early chairperson of the Australia-Japan Friendship
Well, the political imperative was there, wasn't there? Japan quickly flipped into being an ally up against a new enemy, and that led into the Cold War, which in some ways sort of is still plaguing us. All right, how much news is too much, Jack?
Well, I don't watch enough television to be able to tell you. Are you talking about the ABC 24-hour news channel?
Well, we'll get to that in a moment, but I just saw some figures here. Channel 10's breakfast news show, which is a national show, runs across Australia. The ratings are in, and they've got an estimated 44 viewers. That's not 44,000. It's not 4,400. And it's definitely not 44 million. It's just 44 viewers in Sydney. They'll be able to actually name them, just speak to them personally.
I'm always amused at the exactitude of these kind of figures. It's not 43.
No.
It's not 45.
No. Yeah, we are dealing with an estimate. So it could be 30, could be 50, might even be 60. But it's still pretty bloody low for television, isn't it?
When I read that the other day, I thought, are all these people standing behind the camera in the newsroom, or was there anyone at home watching?
I think we're talking about 44 unattached people who said, I like the Channel 10 News breakfast show, and there's only 40 of them in Australia. So, look, that show, what's wrong with cartoons? Why can't kids watch some Warner Brothers cartoons or just put on some cartoons in the morning? Why do we have to have Seven does Sunrise and 9 does Today? They all have fairly low numbers. That's the first thing.
The ABC's got one as well. What are they?
The ABC has a breakfast show as well, and it rates its socks off in relative terms. Yeah,
in ABC terms, it rates its socks off.
Well, they don't pay any attention to ratings, Jack. They don't,
I know.
They don't look. When the ratings data comes in, they don't even look at it.
Only if it's good.
So a lot of these breakfast news programs that exist, there aren't that. The simple fact is, while the ABC, when I say it rates its socks off, it's comparable to the 7 and 9 ratings. Channel 10, obviously, a long way shy of it. But these numbers are still pretty small. I mean, not a lot of people watch breakfast news. It's as simple as that. And there are, it must be said, this is one of the knocks on print journalism, of course, and why people aren't buying newspapers, is that there are just so many other sources of news that you don't need to sit down in front of a television to get it.
Well, I can't recall the last time I picked up a print newspaper of any kind, and I don't often watch the television, but I do get lots of news from the screen.
Look, and that's probably true, but at the same time, we have our smartphones in front of us, and when we want to get some news, we're generally going to go to that, or with our laptops in front of us while we're working. So what we're going to see is more immediate, definitely more informative, and less junk around these sorts of breakfast shows. When they inevitably lapse into the panel, or the sitting around on the couch. What do you reckon about this stuff? Which I really hate.
I find breakfast television just about unwatchable, but there you go. That's just me.
Just junk,
Now tell me, why do, especially given that the ABC keep telling people how little money they have, how they're being starved of funds, why are they spending all this money on a 24-hour news channel, which I'm sure no one watches either?
Well, the answer to that is, you tell me, we'll both know, but I can simply tell our listeners that when the ABC 24 project was created, it was really slammed by staff and some elements of management within the ABC broadcast, within the ABC itself. Good place for goss, Jack. It's a very good place for goss. Get your goss from your soundies and your cameramen, and they'll tell you just exactly what's going on in the place. Well, of course, some of the soundies and cameramen lost their offices in order for these ABC 24 studios.
So there's some rank self-interest in there as well.
There was a little bit, but they were damned opposed to it all, and there was quite a lot of ructions in there. My concern about ABC 24, I think it's not a good spend. First off, let's start with the overall business of why is there this preponderance of television news. Most of the networks outside of the ABC and the ABC too, they start running their evening news program about 3:00, and they'll have various bulletins throughout that. The ABC 24 at this time is doing some political analysis, then it'll drop the news for half an hour and so forth. So what we're seeing firstly is news on a loop.
Yeah.
News on a loop. So what you watch at 2:00 in the afternoon will be almost exactly the same as the news program that you watch at 7:00. Why is it like that? Well, because it turns out that news is cheap. Television news is cheap. Particularly when you're reusing news, which is kind of, contradictory in terms. But yes, so basically we have all these news programs on our networks, on our national broadcaster, because they're cheap. And then we go to panel shows because what precedes ABC News Bulletin in the evening is the drum. And that's even cheaper stuff to produce, because you just get 3 or 4 people in a studio, or indeed even cheaper still, Jack, you just pop them up on Skype, and they don't even have to leave their homes, and they can tell you what they reckon. So we've got.
I rather like the drum because it's got a little bit more actual diversity than most programs on the ABC, but that's just me.
I don't know. I find it unwatchable. Anyway, and I used to be on it, Jack, and I gave it the flick because it really was becoming tiresome. I can let our listeners into a little bit of a secret on these sort of panel shows, that before you attend them, they send you an email with a list of things that they'll be discussing, with some URLs, with some links to click on, and so you can read yourself up and become an instant expert. I find that a little bit much, and so we're sort of veering into opinion. We're not just producing news shows, which are hardcore reports on events. Then we're getting into these panel shows, which allow a great deal of sort of opinion.
Just a word of advice to our listeners: if you want opinions, tune in to us. Don't worry with the ABC.
There's nothing wrong with opinions. It just doesn't belong in news. It just doesn't belong near or around news.
Speaking of news, I was just watching the Albo press conference.
Oh yeah,
it was on this morning, and they've announced a big jobs and skills summit for September. And I thought this was a fabulous idea, and I hope someone goes along and says, let's have a few less fine arts graduates and gender studies graduates, and get a couple more plumbers and carpenters out there.
Well, the construction bit is not too badly off. I mean, they're in terms of skills. I mean, the big skill deficiency in Australia at the moment is in IT, Jack. And
that's my big skill deficiency too. I've been struggling since my IT director, otherwise known as our son, decamped to university in Sydney about 6 years ago.
That must have been a blow. Yeah. But look, IT graduates are walking out of university with their degrees in their hands into the big money because there's a real shortage. Well, yeah, look, it's a great idea. I do like a summit, not because I know the criticisms that will come forward. Oh, it's just a gab fest. Nothing will come from this. Some of these things can be gabfests, of course. Kevin Rudd had it?
I was just going to say, as long as it's not as laughable as Kevin's summit.
What was all that about? It was planning for the future.
So it was an opportunity so Kevin could be down with the kids and sit on the floor and all that sort of stuff and pretend that he was a
But when you're talking about jobs, training, where you've got skills.
I think it's an excellent plan.
Polls. Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea, and it'll get industry, employers, employees, educators, everyone together in the same room and trying to figure out what the best pathway forward.
And we just might figure out that not everyone's got to get a university degree.
You leave us degrees alone, Jack. I got one. Well, I know I tried to get one, and didn't proceed. But it was fun. It was fun while I was there. Look, getting back to our is too much news more than enough topic. The ABC 24 thing. Well, it's not quite 24 hours, is it, Jack? It's not 24/7 because if anyone with insomnia flicks over to ABC 24 at about 2:00 in the morning, they'll see Al Jazeera news programming. Not that that's bad. Al Jazeera do some excellent work, and BBC reporting as well. So they're buying in a good 5 or 6 hours a day.
Look, if they bought in a whole lot of stuff and just ran a 24-hour news service with a small part of it Australian, that would be fine.
Yeah.
But look, the ABC are free to spend their money as they wish. It just doesn't make their case for getting more money very convincing when you're spending it all on a news program that no one watches.
Well, when you do have a big money soak like ABC 24, then what that means is that something's going to suffer along the line. Something, particularly when they had a experience of budget cuts in the last 10 years, really, and so that means that's less local drama produced, less decent comedy produced. The ABC does have some issues in terms of what it commissions now. I think historically it's had some very, very poor decisions around comedy. I think some of their stuff's okay these days because it hasn't just left the commissioning in the hands of a couple of tried and true production companies and go-to production companies, I'd call them. That meant that basically Andrew Denton and his wife were receiving vast amounts of money for producing 2 or 3 shows a week on the ABC. I think it's a bit better now, but the fact is that the pool is smaller because they do have an ABC 24 news channel. It's cheap to produce, but it still costs.
I think we agree on this.
Yeah, all right. Getting to sport, Jack. And we know that the loathed Novak Djokovic has won Wimbledon again and beaten Nick Kyrgios.
It was sort of the battle of the not very likables, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, I get some text messages from mates, and they really don't like Nick at all. I don't have a problem with him. And I know the Australian Sports Department, they really don't seem to like him at all. He did have a few moments, didn't he?
Yeah, there is a bit of history of this. I mean, we didn't much like Leighton Hewitt in the early days of his career, and no one liked Andre Agassi at all in the early days of his career. There was kind of almost 2 Andres, wasn't there? There was Andre 1, the brat from Las Vegas, and then there was Andre 2 after he married Steffi Graf, and he was a quite loved figure.
Lovely bloke by then. But no, he was the brash, loud, and hell of a good tennis player too. And Nick Kyrgios is a wonderful player, and good on him. It's a pretty fair effort to make a Grand Slam, make a Wimbledon final. He got a fairly gentle run in there when Rafa pulled out of the semi. With an injury, but why is he such a polarising figure, Jack? I mean, isn't he Australian, and that's enough?
Well, he might be a pretty well liked figure when he grows up a bit, but that's where he is. He's sort of individual sports can do this to you.
He's 27, Jack. He's not 16. He's 27.
Yeah, but individual sports. You get hangers-on, being yes people around you all the time. Team sports are better for personal development in that sense because you get a few of these edges knocked off you by your teammates.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I actually wish him well. I think he's going to go.
Yeah, so do I.
Got some talent. He barely whacks the ball over the baseline. That's one of those things. He's got this incredible ability to return.
But whether he's going to be better liked, it depends on him.
Yeah. I also think that the media do smell a bit of blood in the water sometimes, and they will go out of their way.
Undoubtedly, that's true. I mean, he fills column inches. He grabs eyeballs.
Clickbait.
So he's clickbait.
Yeah. All right. State of Origin this week, Jack. Get excited. Do you actually get that up in Hong Kong? They send it up?
We get a little bit of rugby league up here, but not as much as we used to. I find that a little bit harder to when I'm watching it, because I don't know all the players the way I used to, or know who they are.
Well, it's easy, Jack. There's a mob in maroon jumpers, and then there's a mob in blue jumpers, and you got
I'm never quite sure which club they're from these days, and that's just because I'd be lucky if you don't see enough of it. These days, just the way the broadcasting's done is we get a hell of a lot of AFL and very little NRL. So
I remember when I first came up to Sydney, I'd go and watch the State of Origin in a pub, and there'd be places packed and all that sort of stuff, and blokes would come up and slap them. Hey, Blues, mate, go, mate. I'm from Victoria. Really not into this kind of parochialism.
Well, I was actually born in New South Wales, so I was born.
Oh, well, you were born blue.
Yeah, and when I first moved to Sydney about the same time as you did, I had some good friends who were very keen to show me what the NRL was about. So I think about the first 4 or 5 NRL matches I saw were all State of Origin and from the good seats. I had a nice introduction to it. Look, I think it's a fabulous bit of sport. There's just no doubt about it.
Oh, there's no doubt. It's no doubt. Look, it is, talking about television, it is the big raid outside of the AFL Grand Final. It is the big raider.
And the pubs, country. Even in Hong Kong, there'll be a lot of pubs pretty busy, because you can really only get it in the pub. There'll be a lot of pubs chock-a-block full of sports fans watching State of Origin.
Who wins?
I think it's 20 years since the Blues have won a decider in Brisbane, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't look great up there, but they really did smash Queensland in Perth in the second half there. They really just ran over the top of them. And on paper, they're a better side. But
it's hard to win in Brisbane.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to win up there. They're going to have beer, if they're lucky, thrown over them when they walk off the ground and when they walk onto it and so forth.
It could even be recycled beer. Anyway, one thing I'd like to see from the AFL, I decided after watching a fair bit of it this weekend, I'd like to see a special round of the AFL.
What do you mean?
Where they all wore their normal jumpers. Without artwork.
Plenty of time for that in the finals, Jack. Plenty of time for that in the finals.
I am just over all the artwork, over all of the kit. I think we could just have a special round where everyone, if you're in Essendon, if you're watching Essendon, it's black with a red sash, and nothing drawn on it.
I just love the way Carlton went to the West Coast Eagles there and just said, we're wearing navy blue. We're not wearing that. We're not wearing the clash jumper. And there were some concerns expressed by some of our fellows in Perth that said Carlton were being a bit arrogant in wearing the navy blue while the Eagles were wearing their royal blue and yellow. They were both in the traditionals. Essendon had a decent win on the weekend.
I watched Essendon play St Kilda the other week, and I think one of the first VFL games I saw was in 1965, so I was 10 years of age, was a grand final, and they managed not to confuse 100,000 people by wearing their normal kit, and I still don't see why they can't do it today.
White shorts and black shorts.
Yeah, white shorts and black shorts.
Yeah. Oh, look, there is the clash. I mean, for example, I'm just saying, Melbourne and Carlton, there's a clash right there. So they can't wear their dark blue, or the Carlton can't if Melbourne are going to wear their dark blue. So they do have this clash space, and of course Port Adelaide aren't allowed to wear the prison bars at all because Eddie Maguire says so. And that's their original jumper, Jack. All right.
Well, there's different views in the Port Adelaide community about that. Some of them say, no, that's the Port Adelaide Football Club, not the Port Power jumper. So.
Well, they put in an application to, I think, we're in the last round, and I don't think it's a showdown, but yeah, they put in the application to wear the prison bars on one occasion this year because the AFL told them if you do it, last season, if you do it, we'll take the points off you. This time they've asked very kindly, very nicely, if they could wear the prison bar jumper, and we're all just waiting here for Eddie Maguire to say no.
Mm.
All right.
Good luck, Eddie.
He doesn't have quite the same pull he does. All right, readers' letters, Jack. Ooh, here we go. And this has come from listener Ben. And he said, just thought I'd share my 2 cents worth about the two Jacks, High Viz and Hard Hats episode. This is it. And I think he's referring to episode 12. I must say that I don't always agree with Hong Kong Jack's take on things, but I do believe that it's good to be exposed to other points of view in this era of hyper-partisanship. Iconoclasm should be encouraged, not stifle, I say. Well, there you go. That's nice, Jack. However, he goes on. However, there's always an however.
Ben, I can assure you there's a hell of a lot of people who hardly ever agree with me.
However, having said that, week 2 of the show, so let's go, Jack, veer into reactionary Facebook boomer territory. Oh, dear. Disputing rising sea levels and fears of Pacific Islanders, as well as the melting of polar ice caps, sounded like something from Sky After Dark programming. A quick Google search shows that CSIRO, World Meteorological Organisation, and World Bank say differently. I did a quick Google search too, well, not a quick Google search, but I did do a Google. NASA has some fairly compelling statistics on the Pacific coast of the United States, going from California all the way up to Washington, and the actual measurements there are between 26 and 38 centimetres of coastal erosion every year for the last 12, Jack. Anyway, I could go on about his opinions, Ben says, about the melting of the ice caps, but I believe the other. Okay. As to his opinions about the disruptive climate protests in Sydney the other week, the good citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, and other southern US states also probably felt the same way about the equally illegal and disruptive civil rights protests in the 60s. Sometimes the boat needs to be rocked. We'll talk about that in a minute, Jack. Keep up the good work, says Ben, though I'd appreciate more evidence-based opinion from Hong Kong Jack. There you go, Jack. But we'll talk about these disruptive climate protests, but we were talking about disruptive protests, and my view is that all protests are disruptive, and it's just that some are more so than others. And we really have to kind of accept that that there's going to be disruption. And when we talked about the climate change protesters some weeks ago, there was a woman there who sort of basically chained herself or restrained herself to her steering wheel of the car, and it meant that basically people couldn't get on from one entrance and go to the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, which caused traffic chaos around Sydney. And then we talked on Friday, Jack, about Dutch farmers who are probably looking at existential threats, but they were doing some very, very dangerous things with their tractors, driving through police cordons and so forth. And it's hard not to be sympathetic with either party. That's my point. That we actually look at these protests and say, well, we'd rather not be disrupted. I don't want to be disrupted, but when you do have protests, there's going to be disruption. That's the whole point of them.
Well, I lived through a year of it here. Well, two separate years of it. That's 3 months the first time and a full year the second time. And my view of it is, whatever the merits of your cause I just don't agree with it.
Yeah, look, I get that. That's just a very strong view there. But yeah, look, the other thing that you have to say about protests is that, and
I might say there's a wide distinction between a march in Selma There was one Sunday afternoon, and people trying to disrupt a whole city, using 6 people to disrupt a whole city, having 6 people glue themselves to the road at the corner of Flinders Street and which intersection, Flinders Street Station there. I just think that's wrong, and I think the people who do that should be charged and feel the full consequences of the law.
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, they're probably going to be detained. I mean, we saw this with the anti-lockdown protesters as well. I mean, that
I have the same view of those as well.
Health orders and all that sort of stuff. And I had some sympathy for them, but they were disruptive. They charged in on a number of occasions, charged through police cordons. I mean, I don't know what to tell you about. Once you go through a police cordon, look out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah,
well, look out because you're going to feel a bit of old-fashioned.
Sometimes a bit of old-fashioned policing might be a good idea.
Well, yeah. What, Roger type?
No, but just a clip behind the ear mightn't hurt,
Oh well,
I just don't agree with. Protesting's changed over the last 20 years, and I think it's been a wholly bad thing. And I think it should be actively discouraged by use of the law.
Yeah, look, I mean, in the end, what you've got is when a sort of mob congregates, regardless of their view, one, you're going to have disruption. Two, that mob is going to have elements within it that are going to cause problems. I mean, it's just something that you almost have to accept. I mean, during some of these protests, some people would say, he goes, don't we have any water cannon anymore? And I said, well, no, we don't. The last water cannon we had in Australia was in New South Wales, Jack, and they gave it to the fire brigade for training, I believe, because they're highly dangerous. They're considered lethal. And now they have non-lethal methods like LRADs, Jack. And that caused all sorts of problems with the protesters because the anti-lockdown guys, because they thought LRADs were, I don't know, they got into some deep conspiracy there. But LRADs, woo! Have you ever seen an LRAD at work? Do they use them in Hong Kong?
They've used almost everything here. We had the absurd situation here where you could, if you perched yourself up on a covered walkway, which we have many in Hong Kong, you could watch the two sides kitting themselves up before.
Yeah, we saw it. Yeah, I've seen all the footage of that. Yeah,
it was like watching the two sides
put the pads
prepare for medieval warfare.
Yeah.
And it's just wrong. I mean, it was a wrong approach by both the police and by the protesters here, in my view.
I remember talking to a couple of HK Hong Kong people. They're friends of mine, and they were very, very supportive of the protesters early on. And with a bit of disruption thrown in about 6 months later, no, all gone.
Yeah, that's sort of my view. Anyway, Ben, lovely to hear from you. You're right, I am a boomer. I don't feel particularly proud of being a boomer because that's just an accident of birth, but I'm very proud of the fact that my parents' generation, the people who produced the boomers, did build such a good life in Australia.
All right, Jack, that's terrific.
And by the way, Ben, can I refer you to the ABC 7 January 2021 University of Auckland study saying that the Marshall Islands and Kiribati, their coral atolls have grown by up to 8% over 6 decades. Not from Facebook, from the ABC.
Oh, okay, Ben. Well, there you go. And look, Ben, have a crack by all means. I can simply tell you that if you look at NASA, Jack, we don't mess with NASA. We know they're not mucking around. They are talking about coastal erosion on the western continental United States. Very, very serious, Jack. Almost or over a foot, over 30 centimetres from the length.
You lived in Double Bay for a while. And just over the next headland, you'd be familiar with the big house called Boomerang that Mark Reed paid for after a great sting on getting closer. I'll believe in rising sea levels when Boomerang's on the market for about £5, 2 and 6 rather than 40 million.
Well, that's a fucking long way from. That's in a harbour for a start. No, I shall send you the link of NASA's study. It's a measurement.
Good.
It's a measurement, so it's not a projection. It's a measurement.
Oh, it's not. It's not one of these computer models. Is it?
No, they've got the tape measure out, mate, and it is actual stuff. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Ben. We do thank you, Ben, for your. I actually went and looked at some material on coastal erosion in some of the South Pacific nations. They're saying that basically, yes, there's coastal erosion, and very often it'll find itself on the other, what's taken away from one side of the island be left on another part of it. But clearly, we would probably want to listen to the good people of Kiribati who've had their cemetery flooded again sometime last year. But look, thank you for your letter, and we do look forward to listening to reading on air all of your criticisms, including you can be scathing about me and Jack. We can take it. We're big old blokes, and we can take punishment. So please, by all means, drop us a line. And that is a wrap for Hard Hats and High Viz episode 14. Thanks for your time, Jack.
Cheers.
See you, viewers. Talk later.